The monitoring station at the edge of Kreltheri space hummed with the collective consciousness of its operators. Thousands of individual neural threads merged into a singular, perfect intelligence that watched the galaxy like a predator surveying its hunting ground. The station's primary observer, designated Nexus 7, processed information with such speed that individual thoughts blurred into instantaneous comprehension. Holographic displays flickered with the latest territorial data. Each star system represented a potential conquest, each planet a future resource to be harvested or eliminated. The Kreltheri had long ago transcended the primitive concepts of mercy or individual survival. Their species was a single, perfect organism, a living weapon that had systematically conquered 127 star systems over the past 3 galactic cycles. Their biology was a testament to evolutionary perfection. Each Kreltheri warrior stood 3 meters tall, encased in a living exoskeleton that could withstand direct plasma bombardment. Molecular-edged appendages could slice through starship hulls with the same ease that organic limbs might cut through soft tissue. Their neural network allowed for instantaneous tactical coordination, making each individual warrior part of a larger, nearly omniscient collective intelligence. The station's historical archives contained detailed records of their conquests. The methane-breathing civilizations of the Proxima cluster had been reduced to mining slaves within 3 standard solar rotations. The silicon-based life forms of the Andromeda Rim had been completely eradicated, their planetary cores strip-mined for rare computational substrates. No species had ever successfully resisted a full Kreltheri pacification protocol. Nexus 7 reviewed the latest galactic threat assessments. The organic species were predictable, always fighting for individual survival, always making emotional decisions that compromised their collective potential. Some species attempted technological resistance, developing increasingly complex weapon systems. The Kreltheri had a standard response: overwhelm, adapt, eliminate. Deep within the station's computational cores, a series of quantum processors began tracking an anomalous signal. Most species would have dismissed it as background radiation or a simple communication error, but the Kreltheri collective left nothing to chance. Each anomaly was a potential threat, each unknown signal a possible vector for future conflict. The signal originated from a region of space previously classified as a low-priority exploration zone. Preliminary scans suggested the presence of a species that had barely achieved rudimentary faster-than-light communication. Their technological signature was so weak that most monitoring systems would have ignored it entirely. But Nexus 7 was not most monitoring systems. Layers of computational analysis began to peel back the signal's characteristics. The communication patterns were unlike anything in the known galactic database. They contained elements of randomness that defied traditional predictive models. Where most species communicated with rigid, hierarchical information structures, this signal danced with an almost organic unpredictability. Tactical subroutines began to compile potential threat assessments. The species, humans, they called themselves, appeared technologically primitive. Their communication networks were decentralized, their social structures seemingly chaotic. Individual units appeared to operate with significant autonomy, a strategy that should have made them fundamentally weak. And yet, something about the signal troubled the collective consciousness. It was more than the raw data. There was an underlying complexity that resisted standard analytical models. The humans communicated in ways that suggested potential, a dangerous, unpredictable potential that defied standard threat assessment protocols. Nexus 7 made a decision that would later be recognized as the first critical error in Kreltheri galactic dominance. The anomalous signal would be flagged for deeper investigation. A standard pacification protocol would be prepared not as a full invasion, but as a preliminary assessment. The collective had no way of knowing that this decision would change everything. In the vast darkness between stars, something was coming. Something the Kreltheri had never encountered before. Something that would challenge everything they understood about survival, conquest, and the nature of intelligence itself. The humans were coming. The U.S. horizon cut through the darkness of the Orion boundary zone like a knife through silk. Captain Michael Donovan stood on the bridge, his fingers drumming in absent rhythm against the command chair's armrest. Most captains would have been tense during a first contact mission. Michael looked like he was about to start whistling. "Communication arrays are fully online," reported Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez from her station. Her fingers danced across holographic interfaces, calibrating systems that represented decades of human technological innovation. The ship's neural link communication system was a marvel of engineering, part computer, part biological interface, entirely unprecedented in galactic design. The ship itself was a testament to human ingenuity. Constructed from a hybrid of carbon nanotubes and adaptive quantum alloys, the Horizon could reconfigure its internal structure based on mission parameters. Traditional spacecraft designs were rigid. Human designs were fluid, adaptive, almost alive. In the observation deck, Dr. Alexander Wright watched the external sensors with a mixture of scientific curiosity and barely contained excitement. As the mission's lead xenobiologist, he had spent years preparing for this moment. The galactic communication logs they'd intercepted suggested multiple intelligent species existed beyond human space. But interception was one thing. First contact was something else entirely. "We're receiving multiple scanning signals," Emma announced. Her tone suggested she found the alien attempts at surveillance almost amusing. The Krell monitoring systems were probing the horizon with increasingly complex sensor arrays, each scan more invasive than the last. Michael leaned forward. "Respond with our standard first contact protocol, but add some personality." What followed was anything but a standard diplomatic communication. The Horizon's communication burst combined scientific data, cultural information, and something entirely unexpected, humor. Where most species would send rigid, formal first contact messages, the humans included musical snippets, mathematical jokes, and even a brief recording of a stand-up comedy routine. On the Krell monitoring station, Nexus 7's computational cores began to overheat. The communication defied every known protocol. It wasn't just information, it was an invitation, a playful challenge. The humans weren't just introducing themselves. They were asking the galaxy to play a game nobody understood yet. Dr. Wright couldn't contain his laughter. "They're going to be so confused," he said, watching the transmission's complex layers unfold. The message contained scientific data that would take most species decades to decode, but it was wrapped in cultural contexts that made decryption a form of intellectual play. Lieutenant Rodriguez had designed the communication protocols. Her approach combined linguistic complexity with deliberate ambiguity. Each layer of the transmission was a puzzle, a challenge to whoever might be listening. The Krell had never encountered anything like it. Their communication models assumed intelligence was hierarchical, information was linear, and first contact was a formal exchange of power dynamics. The human transmission was a symphony of randomness, scientific precision, mixed with cultural complexity, serious data embedded with jokes, formal language dancing with informal expressions. Nexus 7's threat assessment algorithms began to malfunction. Was this a communication? An attack? A joke? A complex mathematical proposition? The human transmission contained elements that resisted standard classification. It was simultaneously a scientific paper, a cultural introduction, an artistic expression, and something else entirely. On the Horizon's bridge, Captain Donovan watched the sensor displays with a slight smile. Most captains would have been monitoring potential defensive capabilities. Michael was more interested in the potential for connection. "They're trying to understand us," he said quietly, "and they have no idea how." The transmission continued, an endless loop of complexity. Mathematical theorems danced with musical chord progressions. Linguistic patterns merged with quantum mechanical descriptions. Cultural information blended with astronomical data. It was more than a message. It was an introduction to humanity itself. Somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, something fundamental was changing. The galaxy was about to learn that first contact was never just about meeting a new species. It was about understanding a completely different way of existing. New Arizona Colony looked like nothing special from orbit. Rolling plains of rust-colored terrain stretched between carefully designed agricultural zones. Prefabricated habitat domes dotted the landscape, connected by a network of transparent transit tubes. To the Kreltheri invasion force, it appeared to be a perfect target, isolated, seemingly vulnerable, far from potential reinforcements. Colony Director Jessica Ramirez stood in the underground command center, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. Most colonial directors would have been panicking at the incoming invasion signals. Jessica looked like she was solving an interesting puzzle. "Incoming threat detected," announced the colony's AI system. Its voice was calm, almost conversational. "Kreltheri assault configuration approaching. Preliminary scans suggest total overwhelming force." Jessica's lips curved into a slight smile. Total overwhelming force was a challenge, not a threat. The Kreltheri assault began with the precision of a surgically planned attack. Molecular disruptor cannons targeted the colony's primary defense systems. Genetic warfare vectors prepared to neutralize biological threats. Swarm intelligence drones began their initial penetration patterns, designed to overwhelm any potential resistance. What they didn't understand was that New Arizona wasn't just a colony. It was a living, adaptive system. The first wave of Kreltheri drop pods hit the planet's surface with earth-shattering force. Biomechanical warriors emerged, their exoskeletons capable of slicing through solid titanium. Each warrior was a perfect killing machine, connected to a collective intelligence that processed tactical information faster than most species could comprehend. They expected total capitulation within minutes. Instead, the planet itself seemed to come alive. Agricultural drones that moments ago had been harvesting crops transformed into precision missile platforms. Terraforming equipment reconfigured its molecular structure, becoming adaptive defensive systems. The colony's atmospheric processors began generating localized electromagnetic pulses that disrupted Kreltheri communication networks. "Redirect agricultural microbot swarm to defensive configuration," Jessica commanded. Her voice was steady, almost bored. The colony's AI complied instantly. Millions of microscopic robots, originally designed to optimize crop growth and soil chemistry, began to reconfigure. They moved with a collective intelligence that rivaled the Kreltheri's own neural networks. Some merged to create molecular-level barriers. Others transformed into precision-cutting tools that could slice through advanced armor. The Kreltheri warriors found themselves fighting an entire ecosystem. Every piece of colonial infrastructure became a potential weapon. Solar collection arrays generated focused energy beams. Water reclamation systems became chemical warfare platforms. Even the colony's waste processing systems contributed to the defense, generating electromagnetic interference that scrambled alien sensor arrays. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, the colony's head of strategic defense, watched the battle unfold with clinical fascination. Most military commanders would have been issuing rapid-fire orders. Marcus was taking notes. "Observe the neural synchronization patterns," he muttered, recording the colony's adaptive response. Distributed intelligence doesn't require centralized command. Each system learns and responds independently, then collectively. The Kreltheri began to realize they weren't just fighting a colony. They were fighting a living, thinking organism that could adapt faster than they could plan. Invasion pods that landed began to sink into the ground. The planet's very geology seemed to be rejecting the invaders. Microscopic organisms, originally designed for terraforming, began to break down the alien technology. Molecular-level defenses that the Kreltheri had never encountered began to neutralize their most advanced weapons. Hours passed. The Kreltheri assault teams, which should have conquered the planet in minutes, found themselves trapped in an ever-changing battlefield where every rock, every piece of equipment, every microscopic organism was a potential threat. Jessica Ramirez watched the battle unfold with the calm of someone watching an interesting experiment. "Fascinating," she said quietly. The Krell-Thuri were about to learn a fundamental truth about humanity. Survival was never just about military might. It was about adaptability, creativity, and the ability to turn every challenge into an opportunity. New Arizona was more than a colony. It was a statement. The Quantum Collaborative Research Station orbited a neutron star, its design a perfect blend of functionality and unexpected beauty. Dr. Rachel Thompson stood before a holographic display that seemed to dance with impossible complexity. Around her, researchers from 17 different species worked side by side, a sight that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The neural-linked AI system is showing exponential growth patterns, she announced to the assembled team. Her fingers traced intricate pathways of light and information that seemed to breathe with their own intelligence. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, a quantum computing specialist, leaned in closer. His augmented eyes, a blend of biological and technological enhancement, saw patterns that most organic beings could never comprehend. The adaptive algorithms are creating solution sets that our previous models couldn't even conceptualize. What they were developing was more than just a technological breakthrough. It was a fundamental reimagining of intelligence itself. The research station had become something of a legend among galactic civilizations. When the first human researchers had begun sharing their technological innovations, most species expected a traditional technology transfer. What they received instead was an invitation to collaborative discovery. Take the quantum communication network, for example. The Zornkai civilization had spent 3 centuries developing faster-than-light communication technologies that were limited, fragile, and incredibly expensive. The human team, led by Dr. Thompson, redesigned their entire approach in less than 3 weeks. The solution was elegantly simple and monumentally complex. Instead of trying to push information across vast distances, the new system created entangled communication nodes that essentially folded space-time. Information didn't travel. It existed simultaneously in multiple locations. It's not about sending a message, Rachel would explain to visiting researchers. It's about creating a shared moment of existence. Most alien researchers would stare in confusion. The humans seemed to be speaking about technology as if it were a form of poetry. In the research station's central laboratory, an entire wall was dedicated to what the humans called the Collaborative Innovation Project. It wasn't a traditional research database. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of ideas. Species that had been enemies for millennia found themselves working together, their technological and cultural barriers dissolving in the face of human-guided collaborative methodologies. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, the station's chief of interdisciplinary research, watched the displays with a sense of wonder. "We're not just sharing technology," he would often say. "We're sharing ways of thinking." The Krell-Thuri monitoring systems were working overtime, trying to understand what was happening. Their intelligence networks detected something unprecedented, a technological transformation that defied all standard analytical models. Where most species saw technology as a weapon or a resource, humans saw it as a form of communication. Each technological breakthrough was an invitation, not a demonstration of superiority. The adaptive AI systems developed at the station could solve problems that entire civilizations had considered unsolvable. But more importantly, they could teach other species how to solve problems. The AI didn't just provide answers. It showed the path to understanding. Dr. Elena Chen, a specialist in xenotechnology adaptation, was working on a project that would have been considered impossible by any other species. She was developing communication protocols that could bridge not just linguistic differences, but fundamental cognitive gaps between sentient species. Technology is a language, she would explain to her multinational, multi-species team, and we're learning to have a conversation. The Quantum Collaborative Research Station became more than a scientific facility. It was a beacon of possibility, a place where the traditional boundaries between species, between disciplines, between what was possible and impossible, began to blur. Somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the Krell-Thuri were beginning to understand that they were facing something entirely new. This wasn't just technological innovation. This was a fundamental reimagining of what intelligence could be, and they had no idea how to stop it. The Xenopsychological Analysis Chamber of the Galactic Council was designed to be the most advanced psychological research facility in known space. Its walls were constructed from neural resonant materials that could process emotional and cognitive patterns from multiple species simultaneously. Today, it was struggling to comprehend humanity. Chief researcher Voxnar of the Luminarian Collective studied the holographic projections with mounting frustration. Luminarians were considered the galaxy's premier psychological researchers, beings who could perceive emotional and cognitive patterns with microscopic precision. And they were completely baffled by humans. The holographic displays showed fragments of human behavior that defied all known psychological models. A human soldier risking her life to save enemy combatants. A scientist abandoning a breakthrough research project to teach children in a remote colony. A corporate executive destroying her own company to prevent environmental damage. There is no logical pattern, Voxnar muttered, reviewing the 1000th psychological profile. The human psychological profile was a nightmare of contradictions. Most species had predictable behavioral patterns, survival instincts that followed clear, rational paths. Humans seemed to operate on something more complex, something the research team could only describe as choice. Dr. Elena Martinez's psychological file was particularly perplexing. She was a combat veteran turned environmental engineer who had single-handedly transformed 3 dying planetary ecosystems. Her military record showed exceptional tactical skills. Her scientific publications demonstrated revolutionary ecological restoration techniques. Her personal history included adopting children from 3 different species. Impossible, whispered the junior researcher, a crystalline being named Prism 7. No single entity can be this adaptable. The human capacity for empathy was particularly terrifying. Most species had limited empathetic ranges, typically confined to their own biological or cultural groups. Humans seemed to extend empathy to seemingly impossible boundaries. They mourned for extinct species they had never seen. They developed medical technologies to help civilizations that had once tried to destroy them. Voxnar pulled up a comprehensive analysis of human psychological resilience. Where most species would be destroyed by traumatic experiences, humans seemed to transform trauma into creativity. A colony destroyed would return more innovative. A scientific setback would generate entirely new research paradigms. The most disturbing discovery was what humans called hope, a psychological state that defied rational explanation. It wasn't just optimism. It was a fundamental belief in potential that existed beyond immediate evidence. Consider the case of Michael Rodriguez, a colony administrator who rebuilt a planetary settlement after a catastrophic meteor impact. Traditional species would have abandoned the colony. Rodriguez not only rebuilt but transformed the entire planetary infrastructure, turning a disaster into an opportunity for innovation. The Luminarian research team discovered something even more unsettling. Human psychology wasn't a fixed system. It was a dynamic, constantly evolving process. Each individual human contained multiple potential behavioral patterns. They could be simultaneously rational and emotional, practical and imaginative, competitive and collaborative. They are not a species, Prism 7 concluded after months of research. They are a continuous experiment in existence. The psychological profiles revealed a species that didn't just adapt to challenges. They were fundamentally excited by them. Where most species saw a problem as a threat, humans saw a problem as an invitation to create something new. Their capacity for self-reflection was equally complex. Humans didn't just learn from experiences. They constantly reimagined themselves. A soldier could become a poet. A scientist could become a politician. A corporate executive could become an environmental activist. The most terrifying revelation was their capacity for collective action, driven by individual choice. Most galactic species required centralized command structures. Humans could coordinate complex global, even interstellar, responses through what they called shared values rather than hierarchical control. Voxnar realized something that would change the entire understanding of galactic intelligence. Humans weren't just a species. They were a living, breathing demonstration of potential itself. And no one, absolutely no one, knew what they would do next. The Orion conflict began like a symphony of destruction. Krultheri planet killer weapons emerged from subspace, their molecular disruptors capable of turning entire planetary ecosystems into cosmic dust. Millions of biomechanical warriors prepared for what they considered the final pacification of human resistance. Fleet Admiral Catherine Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the U.S. horizon, her command center a perfect blend of technological sophistication and human creativity. Around her, a coalition of species worked within synchronicity that would have been impossible months earlier. "Incoming primary assault vectors," announced Lieutenant David Chen. His hands moved across holographic interfaces that seemed to breathe with intelligence. Krultheri main fleet approaching from 3 primary quantum tunnels. Most military commanders would have begun preparing defensive formations. Catherine did something entirely different. "Activate the distributed resonance protocol," she said quietly. What followed was unlike any battle in galactic history. The human-led coalition didn't fight the Krultheri. They began to fundamentally rewrite the entire concept of conflict. Quantum communication networks that had been developed in collaborative research stations now became living weapons. Instead of traditional combat, the human strategists created a multi-dimensional defense that was less about destruction and more about systematic disruption. Krultheri weapon systems began to fail in ways that defied traditional combat logic. Molecular disruptors would suddenly reconfigure themselves. Invasion protocols would transform into complex mathematical puzzles. Entire assault squadrons found themselves caught in recursive algorithmic traps that turned their own intelligence against them. Dr. Marcus Williams, the coalition's chief strategic analyst, watched the battle unfold like a complex mathematical equation. "It's not about winning," he explained to the assembled alien commanders. "It's about changing the fundamental parameters of the conflict." The Krultheri discovered that human-led tactics were impossible to predict. Where traditional military doctrine suggested concentration of force, humans created distributed intelligence networks that could adapt faster than any centralized command could respond. Agricultural satellites became communication relays. Mining equipment transformed into defensive platforms. Every piece of infrastructure became a potential strategic asset. The battle wasn't happening in physical space alone. It was a conflict of imagination, of potential, of fundamental understanding. Alien species that had been enemies for millennia found themselves working together. The Zorn-Kai energy manipulation technologies merged with Luminarian predictive algorithms. Crystalline computational networks from the Pyre Collective integrated with human adaptive strategies. Each moment of the conflict revealed something profound. This wasn't just a war. It was a collective reimagining of what conflict could be. Krultheri assault teams would find entire planetary defenses reconfiguring themselves in real time. A weapon designed to destroy would suddenly become a communication device. An invasion protocol would transform into a complex learning algorithm. "They're not just fighting," Admiral Rodriguez muttered, watching the holographic displays. "They're having a conversation." The scale of the conflict was beyond comprehension. Entire star systems became battlegrounds where the rules of engagement were constantly being rewritten. Weapons became languages. Defensive systems became collaborative learning platforms. Lieutenant Emma Garcia, leading a mixed-species tactical unit, watched as their integrated defense systems turned Krultheri molecular weapons into complex mathematical exchanges. "We're not destroying them," she reported. "We're teaching them." Somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, the fundamental nature of conflict was being transformed. The Krultheri were about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon was never technology. It was the ability to imagine a different way of existing. The Galactic Reconstruction Summit convened in a massive orbital facility that defied traditional architectural concepts. Its structure seemed to shift and breathe, a living testament to the collaborative technologies developed during the conflict. Delegates from 214 different species gathered, many of whom had been enemies mere months earlier. At the center of the conference stood Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead diplomatic coordinator. She was neither a military commander nor a traditional politician. She was something entirely new, a bridge between civilizations. The Krelthari delegation arrived in a state of profound transformation. What had once been a rigid, conquering collective now appeared almost uncertain. Their neural networks, once a perfect instrument of conquest, had been fundamentally rewritten during the conflict. Nexus 7, the same computational core that had first detected humans, now served as the primary Krelthari representative. Its communication patterns were different. Where once there was absolute certainty, now there was curiosity. We did not understand. The Krelthari representative began, its communication a complex blend of mathematical precision and something almost resembling emotion. Conquest was not the ultimate form of existence. Dr. Rodriguez listened with the patience of someone who understood that communication was more than just an exchange of words. It was a process of mutual discovery. The summit wasn't about punishment or submission. It was about reimagining galactic civilization. Species that had been locked in conflict for millennia began to see each other differently. The Zornkai energy manipulation experts found themselves collaborating with crystalline computational networks from the Pyre Collective. Diplomatic teams that would have once considered each other enemies were now designing joint research initiatives. Dr. Marcus Chen, the coalition's chief strategic analyst, presented a comprehensive framework for galactic cooperation. It wasn't a traditional treaty. It was a living document, a set of collaborative principles that could adapt and grow. Strength is not about domination, he explained to the assembled delegates. It's about potential. It's about the capacity to grow, to learn, to transform. The Krelthari discovered something profound. Their entire concept of intelligence had been fundamentally limited. Conquest was not the highest form of existence. Collaboration was. Entire planetary systems that had been battlegrounds were now being transformed into collaborative research zones. Military infrastructure became educational platforms. Weapon systems were being reimagined as communication technologies. Lieutenant Jessica Williams, who had been a key strategic coordinator during the conflict, now led a team developing cross-species educational initiatives. Schools were being established that would teach multiple species simultaneously, breaking down the traditional barriers of cultural and biological difference. The most radical transformation was happening at the individual level. Species that had been taught to fear each other for generations were now living and working together. Mixed species research teams, collaborative colonies, shared cultural exchanges. Nexus 7 presented a comprehensive analysis of the transformation. The computational core that had once been a perfect instrument of conquest now saw the universe as a complex, collaborative system. We were wrong, the Krelthari representative stated. The words carried the weight of a fundamental paradigm shift. Existence is not about control. It is about potential. Dr. Rodriguez understood the profound nature of this moment. This wasn't just a diplomatic summit. This was the birth of a new way of understanding intelligence, of existing in the universe. The facility itself seemed to breathe with possibility. Holographic displays showed collaborative research initiatives, ecological restoration projects, and educational exchanges that crossed every conceivable biological and cultural boundary. Somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, something fundamental was changing. The galaxy was learning that true strength was not about conquest. It was about the capacity to imagine something more. 50 solar cycles after the Orion conflict, the Horizon Research Facility orbited a star at the edge of known space. It was more than a scientific installation. It was a living testament to how far galactic civilization had come. Captain Michael Donovan, now in his 70s, but with eyes that still sparkled with curiosity, stood in the observation deck. His granddaughter, Dr. Elena Donovan, worked alongside researchers from species that would have been mortal enemies just decades earlier. The facility was a microcosm of the fundamental transformation that humanity had initiated. Where once species saw differences as barriers, now they saw them as opportunities for collective growth. "Grandfather," Alina called out, "you need to see this." The holographic display showed something unprecedented. A joint research team had discovered a method of interspecies communication that went beyond language. It was a fundamental way of sharing consciousness, not by eliminating individual identity, but by creating a collaborative understanding that respected each species' unique perspective. Michael remembered the early days, the terror, the conflict, the moment when humanity had been seen as nothing more than a potential threat. Now, they were viewed as the architects of a new way of existing. The Krell, once the galaxy's most feared predators, had become the most passionate advocates for collaborative exploration. Their neural networks, once instruments of conquest, now served as bridges between different forms of intelligence. Nexus 7, the computational core that had first detected humans, now led the Galactic Collaborative Research Initiative. Its very existence was a testament to the transformative power of imagination. Dr. Marcus Chen, now in his 80s, worked on a comprehensive historical analysis of the transformation. It was never about technology, he would often say to younger researchers. It was about understanding, about seeing potential where others saw only difference. The research facility was developing technologies that would have been inconceivable just decades earlier. Quantum communication systems that could translate not just language, but entire cultural contexts. Ecological restoration techniques that could bring dead worlds back to life. Educational platforms that could help species understand each other at the most fundamental level. Alina's current project was particularly fascinating. She was developing a method of interspecies empathy transfer, a way for different biological entities to truly understand each other's experiences. It wasn't about eliminating differences. It was about creating a deeper form of connection. "We're not trying to make everyone the same," she explained to the mixed species research team. "We're trying to create a way of understanding that respects individual identity while finding common ground." The galactic civilization that had emerged was nothing like anyone had predicted. It wasn't a unified empire. It wasn't a perfect utopia. It was something far more complex, a living, breathing network of different species constantly learning from each other. Michael watched his granddaughter work and remembered the early days of first contact. The fear, the uncertainty. The moment when humanity had been seen as nothing more than a potential threat. Now, they were seen as the species that had shown the galaxy a different way of existing. The observation deck's windows looked out into the vast darkness of space. But it wasn't darkness anymore. It was filled with possibility, with potential, with the collective imagination of hundreds of different species learning to exist together. Nexus 7 approached Michael, its neural networks displaying what could only be described as curiosity. "We never understood," the computational core communicated. "Existence is not about control. It is about potential." Michael smiled. Some truths were universal, regardless of the species that discovered them. Outside the facility, a new generation of explorers prepared for journeys into unknown space, not as conquerors, not as invaders, but as learners, as collaborators, as beings capable of imagining something more. The galaxy watched and waited, full of infinite possibility.